Hello and welcome back. I hope that things are going well for you as you increasingly settle into the spring term. We're now at week number 2. I appreciate you all giving your introductions, sharing a little bit about yourselves in our first week's activity. I look forward to taking some time to get into some of the specifics of communication research design more this week, specifically getting into some of the ways that we can do textual methods of communication. So later on in the term, you'll be doing a research proposal that relates to using textual methods. So the work that we'll develop this week, next week, does a great job of giving you a foundation that you can use in building together that proposal and understanding how to go about doing this type of method of communication and research analysis. So let's go ahead and get started. So for this week, we'll be looking at 2 of the major ways that we can do textual methods. I also want to give just a couple of housekeeping notes and updates. Canvas discussion number 2 is available for you to work on, and it is due by this Sunday. Make sure that you've also replied to students from the first Canvas discussion as well. Also note that while the free PDF was available for the first week, you do want to make sure that you've secured access to the textbook for this week's assignment, since that will require you to reference that textbook as you're completing parts of this week's Canvas discussion. I encourage you to get a copy of the Amazon ebook that I linked in the first announcement for the course. You might also get a copy from the EOU bookstore or order a copy online. If you know that you're not able to receive a copy for yourself and complete this week's assignment on time, let me know as soon as possible so that I can still get you access to the reading for this week. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit more about how we go about doing methods. You recall from last week, we talked about methods as essentially the ways that we answer our questions in communication. If we have a question, for example, how is persuasion used to convince the American public on topics like immigration, right? You could go about this textually, analyzing something like a speech, an address, or a press release. You could go about this qualitatively, doing something such as an interview to determine how people are influenced by the communication they receive on this topic. Or you could go about this quantitatively, doing something like a survey to gauge people's opinions or attitudes on the topic. So in other words, right, methods are the ways that we answer the question. They're the data that we gather. And so the types of methods that you use is going to determine how that question ultimately gets answered, the scope and scale of your ability to answer that question, and the range of opinions and opportunities available in that process too. So let's talk a little bit more about textual methods, right? So textual methods essentially are evaluating written, spoken, and or verbal, right? If something is a text, that means that it is something that either through an image, through a speech, through a sequence of words, it is something that is stable and available to analyze, right? So a text does not necessarily just mean that something is like a written speech or essay, although that can certainly be analyzed. It could also be something like a film, right? Or a television show, where you're analyzing this text, this artifact, this piece of communication. Or it could be something like a live speech or presentation. In other words, if it's involving communication, including the use of visual communication, it is something that's concrete and available for an audience to view and to understand, then that would be considered a text for analysis. Compare that to something like an interview, where you have to gain that information from your conversation with the person, or something like a survey, where you have to collect that data for yourself. A text is something that exists, that is available for you to understand how something is communicated. A great example of this, one of the most heavily studied speeches, has been Lincoln's address at Gettysburg, right? I'm talking about abolition of slavery. And so this has been analyzed a lot for the major themes, ideas, and thoughts that emerge from this speech and the impact this speech had. Employing textual methods to understand how various elements of the speech came together to be persuasive and effective, and how they use signs and symbols to communicate. So when it comes to conducting textual analysis, the 2 areas we'll focus on today are semiotics and rhetorical analyses. Let's first talk about semiotics, right? So semiotics is the study of signs. If you think about the word dog, right? The word dog you think about just a bunch of lines, squiggles, and points, but they're connecting together to form something coherent, right? You hear dog, and it doesn't actually look like a dog, but you see the collection of letters together, and it elicits or brings to mind the idea of a dog. In other words, that's semiotics, right? Our language choices, our words, are the use of signs to convey social reality. In other words, we're using a signifier, in this case, the letters DOG, to convey the signified, or the cultural attitudes, beliefs, and values that are associated with that signifier. So for instance, if I were to say the word dog, perhaps the type of dog that you think of that comes to mind is going to be different. Maybe you think about a dog that's sitting near you as you're watching this video. Maybe you're thinking about a dog you had growing up, or maybe you're thinking about this French bulldog, which, by the way, has been dethroning other popular dog breeds as the most popular dog breed. So, the definition and cultural attitudes of what a dog is and what we think about when we hear the word dog have definitely changed, right? So the signifier is the thing that's being represented, the thing that language is using to share. The signified is what that stands in to represent. You see the word dog, you think of this four-legged creature, right? So signifier, signifier. So semiotics is trying to understand how symbols are being used to convey things and to share things to the public. So part of this comes from the work of C.S. Peirce and C.S. Peirce's contributions to understanding elements of semiotics, right? So one of them is the idea of icons, which symbolize something by resemblance. If you're walking down the street and you see a pedestrian sign, right, somebody's walking, you notice from that pedestrian sign that it looks like a person walking across the street, so you know to be cautious and make sure that you're identifying anybody who might be crossing. Indexes are signifying by cause and effect. One really good example of this is if you're out in the woods and you see heavy smoke, right? You know that there's probably a fire. And then symbols are using convention, right, to symbolize or represent something. So a good example of this is the pi symbol representing 3.1415. Right? We're using conventions, attitudes, and norms to recognize that the pi symbol is standing in for and representing this very long number with very many decimals that would be very difficult for us to write the same way every single time. We use shorthand through the use of symbols. So many of you might be familiar with the new Barbie movie that's coming out, right? It's received a lot of press attention, had a trailer, right? And one of the things that's interesting in analyzing this preview is its use of imagery. Barbie is very much known for the very bright pink colors, very saturated colors, right? And the way that those colors are being used to convey this sort of like saccharine, but also kind of a little bit off vibe in the film, right? That's the kind of feel that the film is giving off and part of why people are interested in it, right? So if we're doing like a semiotic analysis of this film trailer, we would be looking at how it uses things like color, like lighting, like tone in order to convey this kind of unsettling or interesting image. So denotation is referring to the dictionary definition of a word, right? If we were doing semiotic analysis, what does the word mean? Whereas connotation refers to more culturally constructed meaning, right? So if we think about denotation, right, Barbie is a doll, but in a connotation, we might think about it being discussed in 2023. A lot of Gen Z folks are actually starting to use clothing from Barbie, kind of in reference to the film and its their interest in that type of fashion, right? So the culturally constructed meaning and the significance attached to a particular word or phrase, something we might analyze. Metaphor and simile are also used as well. How do we use analogy to sit in and represent something else? We can also use association, right? So you might see a Rolex and know that that's very expensive and assume somebody who has a Rolex has a lot of money. Synecdoche is a smaller part who's standing in for the whole. So for example, if somebody is referring to the executive office, referring to the presidency, sometimes you'll hear the phrase the Oval Office being used, referring to the oval-shaped space in which a president occupies. Intertextuality is like using language from one text and borrowing that to another. I saw something recently about a reality TV show in which children are being asked to build their own society. And somebody described this TV show as very Lord of the Flies, right? Borrowing from that text, from that book, and the way that that described what happened when kids got to control of society and putting it in another context. And then codes are referring to structured behavior, for example, norms and practices, like giving somebody the thumbs up sign to indicate that they're doing well. Cultures develop a sense of codes in order to explain phenomena with one another. In terms of employing semiotics, we can do it in a couple different ways. One is a symptomatic analysis. In other words, what is the sequence of texts that's giving something meaning? So how, if we're analyzing the different texts that are being used, for instance, the different types of symbols, whether they're visual or whether they're using direct language, how are they, if strung together, conveying a message? And then how, in a paradigmatic analysis, are oppositions being used to develop meaning? For example, we might see color contrasts in opposition being used. For instance, maybe one color is used very strongly with one character to indicate that they're good, another color with bad. A lot of film and a lot of advertisement uses white for good and black for bad. And of course, that has severe racial connotations as well. What does it mean to associate color in that way, right? That has serious ramifications and something that can be critiqued as well, is the sort of racialized implications of using color as symbolism, right? You think about white being associated via metaphor as well, and we can pick apart some of the ways that that's being used, right? Somebody is shadowy, right? Being used in a negative connotation versus someone being light being used in a positive connotation, right? So even if those terms are not used to describe race, they bring about those implications to talking about those issues, right? So in transitioning, we can look at the idea of rhetorical analysis as well. You might be familiar with rhetoric, having taken courses in communication studies before. Rhetoric, of course, is referring to the available means of persuasion. Ethos, referring to appeals to credibility and background. For example, talking about how you got your PhD in psychology, so you know a thing or two about human behavior. Pathos being the use of appealing to human emotions, getting people to laugh, or invoking pity, telling a sad story about your life. And then logos is the use of logic or structured argumentation, reaching a conclusion from various premises or assumptions to help you to get to that point, right? So rhetoric, going all the way back to the Greeks and Aristotle, is using communication to reach some type of audience, right? Effectively, rhetoric is able to convince people about a variety of different topics. But one of the concerns the Greeks had is that rhetoric could, quote, make the weaker argument the stronger. That is, at its worst, rhetoric is not about really trying to convince people toward the truth, but like being a used car salesperson who might not always be honest in how they're selling the car, right? They might be more concerned with telling people what they want to hear or what will get the sale than what might be correct. If they were to say some of the problems with the car, they might be less likely to get the sale. So rhetoric is concerned with some of the problems that might come about as a result of the effort to try to persuade people. There are a variety of different rhetorical devices. You'll see them discussed in the chapters for this week. I'm not going to go over all of them in detail. And a number of these are also ones that are related to the study of semiotics too. But what you need to know here is that in the study of rhetoric, we're looking at how these types of things are used in a text. And again, it could be visual, it could be written to convey various ideas, whether it's using an allegory or narrative to compare something to something else, right? So you might be familiar with the allegory of the cave, in which the idea of being trapped in a cave and only getting to see the shadows of the world outside is being used as a way to represent the idea of intellectual enlightenment and learning information. Other things such as ambiguity, where it's having multiple meanings, using euphemisms to stand in for something else in cultural contexts, using things such as paradox or things that contradict each other, or using an understatement to undersell something, like saying, oh, well, my opponent has a little bit of experience. Those types of things can be used in a lot of persuasive contexts in order to effectively convey ideas. You might also be familiar with genre in rhetoric, right? So you might be familiar with forensic. Forensic is a rhetoric that's focused on the past. It's trying to make sense of history. So we see a lot of discussion and controversy surrounding history and about how we come to understand and know history. So that can be one way of us studying. We also have epididactic, which is celebration or censure in the present. Something such as a funeral eulogy or a wedding toast or roast is an example of epididactic rhetoric. And then deliberative rhetoric is focused on the future, right? So it might be like a policy discussion or roundtable or people speaking on the floor of Congress about what we need to do in order to deal with an issue. In other words, these genres allow us to understand what the argument was that was being made and what was being used to make that argument. So to wrap up some of the key ideas we talked about, right? Textual methods are looking at texts. They are looking at stable things, use language, that use symbols, that communicate in a variety of different ways, whether it's a visual poster, a film, speech, some type of essay, right? They're using language and communication to engage. And if we take a semiotic approach, we're looking at how those signs and symbols are being used. And if we look at a rhetorical approach, we're looking at the persuasive message and how that persuasive message is working. How are they able to convince people, right? So for this week's activity, I'm going to be asking you to practice these two different approaches, to pick a commercial and explain how that commercial could be used in a semiotic way. So what are the signs? What are the symbols that you're noticing, and how are those symbols being used for a message? Versus in a rhetorical perspective, how is persuasion being used? What are the persuasive messages that are being given, and how do those try to reach an audience? So you'll have the chance to try both of those formats out and better understand how these work in practice. Next week, we'll be further looking at textual methods and looking at a couple other ways that we can do that. Have a great rest of your week, and we will continue with our discussion as we get further into textual methods next week. Have a good one.